Charles William Maynes has served as editor of Foreign Policy magazine, one of the leading journals in the world on international affairs, since 1980. Over the course of his career, Mr. Maynes has held positions in the Department of State, the U.S. Congress, and the foundation world. He was raised in Kansas and Utah, and he graduated from Harvard University magna cum laude, having been elected to Phi Beta Kappa as a junior. He studied at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, where he earned first-class honors in politics, philosophy, and economics. In 1962, Mr. Maynes entered the Foreign Service, working in the Department of State on United Nations matters, specializing in arms control and disarmament issues. In 1964, he was transferred to Laos, where his job was to analyze the Lao currency. Subsequently, he was assigned to Moscow as an economic commercial officer. During the 1972 presidential campaign, he worked on the issue staff of Sergeant Shriver, the Democratic nominee for vice president. In 1972, Mr. Maynes began work for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, directing its international organization program. In 1973, he became the institution's secretary. President Carter named him Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs in January of 1977. In that capacity, he had responsibility for U.S. policy in the United Nations and its specialized agencies. Mr. Maynes is a member of the National Academy of Public Administration, the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the Washington Institute of Foreign Affairs, and the United Nations Association, as well as recipient of the State Department Meritorious Service Award. It is a great pleasure then for me to introduce him to you now, Charles William Maynes.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Every time I listen to someone introduce either myself or someone else and list all of the organizations that he belongs to, I realize that what that really means is that I pay my dues. Anyway, this is an exciting time to talk about American foreign policy. We were chatting before this meeting about how each one of us these last few weeks walks out to the end of his driveway, picks up the paper, and yet another assumption of the post-war order has been dispelled or destroyed. We are really in revolutionary times in international relations, and I think there's a tendency on the part of some of my colleagues in Washington to think that in a way the United States is on a roll. You hear a lot of talk in Washington about the Cold War is over and we have won it. There are some respects in which that is true, but my talk tonight is going to be somewhat more sober than that. I am going to talk about some of the advances that we've made, but I also want to talk about our own changed position, because I think, in fact, it is somewhat sobering as well. If you look at the position of the United States in the 1950s, for example, in the United States today, one can't help but be struck by the difference. In the 1950s, the United States had nuclear superiority. There was no country in the world that could threaten the survival of the United States. In the 1950s, the United States, with almost a trivial decision, could overthrow the government of Guatemala. I think wrongly, but we did it, and we did it very cheaply. It didn't cost very much, and now we've had two presidents that have been unable to overthrow Mr. Noriega, who lives in a country that was actually created by the United States, that has thousands of U.S. troops stationed on its soil, and that even uses the U.S. currency. Or let me give another contrast that will show you just how much has changed. Between 1948 and 1952, in 1982 dollars, the United States gave, not loaned, gave the Europeans $100 billion for the Marshall Plan. Now, when President Bush went to Poland and to Hungary and the Poles told him that they needed something in the order of $10 billion in order to help save their economy. We can argue over the figure, but certainly it's in the billions. It may not be 10 billion, but it certainly is in the billions that they need. Whether the president offered them $100 million, the same day that he offered it, a Polish-American heiress flew to Poland and offered $100 million of her own to buy the Gdansk shipyard. So we had a private American citizen rivaling the President of the United States in the amount of money that he could make available to Poland. When he came back and actually submitted his budget for the current year, there was only $15 million in the budget for Poland because of fiscal stringency. Now, you know, something has changed. Something has changed that the United States between 1948 and 1952 could feel that it was rich enough, confident enough, powerful enough to give the Europeans $100 billion. And right now we have trouble pulling together $15 million for an aid program to Poland, which has actually been promised at $100 million. Now, what has happened? I would argue that what has happened really has to be traced back to the Nixon administration, when the three pillars on which American hegemony after World War II rested buckled at roughly the same time. And the country, I would argue, has never been the same since, despite the efforts of many of our politicians, particularly during election time, to try to contend that this either isn't the case or that they have some magic solution that is going to bring us back to the earlier days. What are those three pillars? The first was this nuclear superiority, and by the early 1970s, the Soviet Union had not achieved numerical parity. We still had more warheads than they did, but they had achieved essential parity. For the first time, no one in the U.S. government who knew anything about it disputed the fact that if we got into a war with the Soviet Union, they could destroy us just as easily as we could destroy them. And that was a profound change. And it happened in the early 70s. The second major change was that we lost control of the world's energy market. We all know about the activities of OPEC in the early 1970s, but what many of us overlook is that at the same time we lost control of the nuclear energy industry as well, and our European friends began to compete actively with us on the international market. The final pillar that buckled was the U.S. control of the international monetary system. We abandoned the Bretton Woods system, you may recall, in the early 1970s. And instead of bureaucrats in the U.S. Department of Treasury or the Federal Reserve Board making decisions, it became the market. Now, I would argue that any country that suffered that kind of simultaneous change would be dramatically affected, and obviously the United States was. But I think there was another factor that helps explain the change in America's position in the world today and its position after World War II. And that factor is a psychological one. I think that for most of the post-war period, the United States enjoyed a psychological advantage, and that was the deference that other countries had for American power, American ideals, and the American model. Now, deference, I think, is important for the organization of any social order, either at home or abroad. If we didn't have deference toward authority, we'd have to have policemen on every corner in order to maintain order. In the international field, we have, in effect, in past centuries, had policemen at every corner. And if you look at how some of the great empires in the world maintained this deference, they did it through the ruthless use of force. We tend to have a benign view of the British Empire, for example. But how did the British control this enormous area that they did with only 100,000 British troops? They did it through a variety of policies designed to force deference on those whom they ruled. And anybody who challenged the empire was quickly punished. And in fact, in Africa, the key issue was the machine gun. British soldiers controlled the machine gun. Native soldiers were never allowed near it. And British soldiers were under orders never to surrender the machine gun, because that was how they got the deference. In the American South, whenever a black failed to show adequate deference, the white sheeted riders of the Ku Klux Klan mounted up to make sure that it was reestablished. We're viewing an effort by Israel on the West Bank right now to force deference on the Palestinians. In fact, the current Prime Minister of Israel has said publicly that the purpose of Israel was to put the fear of death back in the minds of the Palestinians. The former vice mayor of Jerusalem has said that the purpose of the repression on the West Bank is to, quote, wipe the smirk off the face of the Palestinian protesters. This is nothing other than an effort to try to compel deference on the part of people who are being ruled. Now, obviously, some governments go much further than others in the tools that they use to compel deference. The show trials in Eastern Europe or the death squads in Central America are designed to get deference out of these populations, to make these people afraid to protest. And one of the fascinating things that's happening in world politics these days is that people all over the world, in country after country, for some reason that none of us can adequately explain, no longer seem to fear their armies or their police. They're marching in the streets, and they are creating political revolutions from Central America to Warsaw. Well, I would argue that America's post-war hegemony also rested on deference, but not a deference of fear, but a deference of respect. And I think that was a key element in the unique role that we had in the world. It's true that there may have been a few governments in Latin America that feared that if they failed to show adequate deference to the United States, that the Marines would arrive on their shores the next week. But that's only in our hemisphere, and even then I think it has to be qualified. But certainly in other parts of the world, the deference that was shown to the United States rested on respect and not on fear. I think in this respect that many of the people in the United States who talk about the Vietnam syndrome have got the problem confused. They seem to act as though the goal of American policy in the world should be to reestablish fear of American power. I think the goal should be to reestablish respect for American power. And it is the respect which we have lost which has contributed, I think, to some of the problems we have faced in recent years. Well, now, if you look at these three pillars that I was talking about, do we see changes that are going to take place that will reestablish the American preeminence as we once knew it? And I would argue the answer is no. At the end of the Reagan administration, there was a very prestigious commission created by the Pentagon. It included such luminaries as Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, and they argued that we could reestablish this deference through the development of so-called smart weapons. We were going to get weapons that were so good that we would be able to put them right on the target that we were aiming at without any losses by the United States and very few civilian casualties in the countries against which we were aiming these weapons. Well, now, if we had such miraculous weapons, obviously I think that would do a great deal to restore our post-war edge. I don't think it would do much in Europe itself, because I can't imagine the United States using such weapons for offensive purposes. So we would simply shore up the stalemate that is already there. But in the third world, I think that if we had such weapons, it would make a great deal of difference. For example, had Ronald Reagan had such weapons, he might have been less reluctant to strike such alleged malefactors as Syria, which the administration said was sponsoring international terrorism. We could do that because we could be sure that there would be few U.S. casualties, and we would only hit the people that we wanted to hit. But I think there are at least three reasons why this dream is exactly that, a dream, and not a reality. The first is that I don't think the weapons are going to be as smart as their designers contend. It's not very reassuring to me that in our bombing raid on Libya, we used smart bombs, and several of them ended up in the garden of the French ambassador. I can't believe that that was the intended target. A second reason that I think the dream will remain a dream is that even if the weapons are that good, I doubt that our intelligence will be that good. You all may recall the commando raid on the prisoner of war camp in Vietnam in 1970, the Song Thai prisoner of war camp raid. There probably was no piece of real estate in Vietnam that our intelligence zeroed in on more carefully. And yet, when our commandos arrived at great risk to their lives, they found that a few days before, the POWs had been moved. So I'm not sure that we will always know where we ought to be aiming these weapons. But the final reason that I don't think that such weapons will restore our edge goes back to this question of deference and the kind that we had after World War II. What we require is a deference of respect and not of fear. And the foolish or foolhardy use of such weapons can lower the respect for the United States. The image of the United States can be transformed from that of a well-meaning but can be transformed into that of a well-meaning but reckless cowboy, as opposed to that of a firm but benevolent uncle, which I think is the image we really want. And I would also point out that respect for the Reagan administration was never higher than when the president was in the Kremlin negotiating with Gorbachev, and never lower in the world than when we were raining bombs on Tripoli. If we look at the financial field, I think we're all aware of that the United States in recent years has gone from being the greatest creditor in the world community to the greatest debtor, so that it seems to me very unlikely that we can reestablish our economic edge. And the National Petroleum Council warns that given current policies, U.S. imports, imports as a percentage of U.S. petroleum needs are likely to rise from something like 25% in 1985 to something like 45% in 1995. So we are becoming more dependent in the energy field, not less dependent. I think in other words, when you look at all three pillars, it's difficult to see how the United States can regain that edge that we had after World War II, except in the field of diplomacy. And here I think that there is room for improvement in any administration, no matter how well it does. If you look at all of the problems of the world, one is, at any of the major problems of the world, one is struck by the fact that the United States has a critical role to play in virtually every one of those problems. And so a constructive, enlightened diplomacy can restore or strengthen or improve a respect for American word and for American policy, and can improve our place in the world. Well, with this as a setting, let me talk about two problems that I think are going to trouble our foreign policy during the Bush years and during the years of his successor. And those two are what I call the resource gridlock and the knowledge revolution. And let me talk briefly about each of those. We've had a debate open up in this country, in part because of some very important books that have been written, as to whether the United States can afford the foreign policy that it has. I'm talking about books like the one by Paul Kennedy on the rise and fall of great powers, or David Kaleo of Johns Hopkins on the NATO alliance. Robert Gilpin from Princeton has written an important book on a similar subject. All of these people argue that, in effect, the United States is losing its economic edge because it is overcommitted militarily abroad. And they argue that in order really to be competitive, the United States should shift some of that burden to its European and Japanese allies. On the other side of the argument have been the so-called alliance traditionalists, and probably the foremost among those in recent years has been Secretary of State George Shultz, who used to argue that this view of people like Kennedy and others was simply nonsensical if you looked at the historical record. When the United States had a very high defense burden in the 1950s, over 9% of GNP, we grew faster than we're growing now when we have a defense burden of something like 6.7% of GNP. So he says they're just wrong. Well, I would like to suggest that one reason that it's so difficult to decide between these two schools of thought is that in a very fundamental sense, both are right. It seems to me incontestable that if some of the money we spent on defense were spent on wisely, that's important to underscore, but wisely on education or infrastructure or any of the things that are relevant to competitiveness and productivity, that this country would be better off in its competitive race with others on the international scene. But at the same time, I do agree with George Shultz that there is nothing that we need to do in defense that we couldn't compensate for by adequate policies at home. We could pay for it if we would adopt the right policies. We haven't adopted the right policies, but we could adopt them. So it seems to me the issue really comes down to political will. And here I would argue that it's very important for all of us to understand just how much this country has changed in the last 30 years because of the civil rights revolution. I would argue that in an indirect way, our tolerance for very high defense budgets in the 1950s was related to the fact that a lot of people in this country didn't have the vote, and they now do. And they're demanding programs in response to the vote they had. Most of us don't realize that Martin Luther King gave the vote not only to blacks, but to many whites. Because in the South, when actions were taken to disenfranchise blacks on grounds of literacy or other criteria like that, in order to avoid the charge that they were discriminating against blacks, they applied the same standard to everybody in the electorate. And so if you look at the election statistics in states in the South, you find that black voting virtually ceased by the 1920s, but white voting had gone down 50% from what it was in the last quarter of the previous century. These were all whites who were disenfranchised because they couldn't pass the test as well. I think what the civil rights movement has done is to lift a reactionary anchor in American politics and to open up the political system to a lot of programs that are quite expensive. We can disagree on how needed they are, but I think they are needed. I'll make my credentials or my point of view clear right now. But the fact is that they are part of our political system right now. They can't be changed. They are the consequence of these massive changes in our political system, which took place in the 60s and the 70s. Let me turn to the knowledge revolution. Here, I think that something that is going to change diplomacy and politics all around the world is the growing ability of ordinary people in every country to receive and understand information. And I think the key to this is literacy. I think we have all underestimated just what a revolutionary impact literacy is having on international politics. And let me take three very different areas of the world and try to indicate to you what I mean. Take our own country. Where did the civil rights revolution come from? I would argue one place it came from is the extraordinary increase in the number of blacks in the United States who had a high school education or better. In 1940, only 11% of blacks in their 20s in the United States had gone past high school. By the end of the 60s, it was up over 60%. It was headed towards 60%. Now, this is a profound revolution a profound social revolution in the United States, and this is where Martin Luther King got his lieutenants for the race. For the effort to change America's racial laws. Or take a totally different country, our big adversary, the Soviet Union. Why is Gorbachev able to change the Soviet Union as much as he has? Now, obviously, he is one of the most creative and gifted political leaders to reach a national stage, I would argue, in this century. But I don't think that alone explains it. I think that the change in the Soviet people in terms of their sophistication and literacy helps to explain a lot of it. In 1939, when Stalin was at his height, only 10% of the Soviet people had a 10th grade education. When Khrushchev was beginning his reform effort, only 32% of the Russian people had a 10th grade education or better. Today it's 89%. It's 89%. When Stalin was ruling the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union was largely a rural country. And one of the reasons for the collectivization effort was to get control of that countryside. Today, the Soviet Union is almost as urbanized as the United States. So it is very difficult to run the Soviet Union with the old methods. The people are less and less willing to tolerate them. You've had a profound social revolution in that country, I think. Or take an area that is giving us lots of trouble right now, which is Central America. Once again, I think you see this phenomenon of growing literacy and urbanization. In 1960, something like 45% of the people of Central America were literate. By the mid-70s, that was nearing 75%. Now you're talking about, we're not talking about PhD levels of literacy, but we're talking about a degree of sophistication where people can understand what's happening to them and who might be responsible for it, and perhaps a growing unwillingness to tolerate this. I think this kind of development is going to continue to ricochet all over the world. It's going to transform the politics of every country, transform the diplomacy of every country. That isn't to say that all the changes that are going to take place are good or that we're going to like them. But I do think it's going to be harder and harder for one individual or for a handful of individuals to control completely the affairs of their country. They're going to have to take into account the demands, the needs of a growing number of people who are demanding some kind of voice in how they run their country. Now, with having made those points, let me conclude with some brief remarks on what I see as the four main challenges of the 1990s. And I see them as the economic challenge, the security challenge, the Latin challenge, and the global challenge. And let me speak briefly on each of them. The economic challenge, I think, for the United States is going to come from the fact that for most of the post-war period, American diplomats had a unique advantage, and that was that they represented the only country in the world that I'm aware of that could subordinate economic needs to security needs. For most of American diplomacy after the post-war period, security policy was high politics and economic policy was low politics. Hans Morgenthau once said that the three tools of statesmen are logic, bribes, and threats. And the United States has had lots of money for the second tool, but the money is drying up, and it is going to make it much more difficult for American diplomats. They're going to have to live on their wits as opposed to their wallet, and it may be a traumatic change for many of them. I think that because of the shift in America's position in the world, we have a major problem in the coming years, and that is with the United States unwilling or unable to assume a disproportionate share of the leadership costs of trying to hold this system together. We're going to have to try to persuade our allies to share this burden. But we, in turn, are going to have to share the leadership. And this is going to be painful on both sides, I think. Let me turn to the security challenge. Here, obviously, with what is going on in Central Europe, we are going to have to re-examine the alliance systems that exist in Europe. If East Germany continues on a trajectory that carries it first towards some kind of quasi-democratic and then finally democratic rule, it is very difficult to see how the United States and its allies can proceed down the path that they have drawn for themselves. I would think it would be almost impossible, for example, for the United States to persuade the Federal Republic of Germany that we ought to modernize the Lance missiles, which would then fall, if they were ever fired, not on totalitarian East Germany, but on democratic, brotherly East Germany. This is quite a transformation. Similarly, those missiles could barely, under some circumstances, hit Poles. Are we going to feel the same way about aiming missiles against not pro-Soviet, anti-American Poland, but democratic, pro-American Poland? I think we face a major reassessment of some of these policies. The task for American policymakers, I think, will be to design a security order which meets the legitimate security concerns of all of the major parties of the European continent, including the Soviet Union, and legitimates an American presence there, much reduced, but I would argue permanent. And one of the debates will have to be how large that presence will be and what form of legitimacy should be designed to justify it. But I think that is the task which we are facing. In addition, however, I think we are facing a major proliferation problem in the world that we are at last going to have to come to grips with. And it's a proliferation problem that is both vertical and horizontal. Now, vertical means that the existing powers are increasing the number of arms that they have. Well, if we have the kinds of agreements with the Soviet Union we hope we get, the United States and the Soviet Union will be reducing their arsenals. But many people overlook what is happening in France and Great Britain. They are in the process of a modernization effort that will increase the number of warheads they have from something like 300 today to something like 1,200 or 1,500 by the end of the 1990s. Now, you've got to realize what we're talking about. We're talking about nuclear devices that are absolutely devastating in their power. To give you some idea of what will happen at the end of the 90s, France will have the capability, if it strikes the Soviet Union, of killing 80 million Soviet citizens and destroying 2/3 of the industrial capability of the Soviet Union. And Britain, by the end of the 90s, will have the capability of killing 68 million Soviet citizens and destroying 1/2 of the industrial capability of the Soviet Union. To put these figures in some kind of perspective, at the end of the 60s, Robert McNamara argued that if the United States achieved a force that could kill 1/4 of the Soviet population and destroy 1/2 of its industrial capability, that the Soviet Union would be eliminated as a major power for decades. Well, France and Britain are going to have that kind of power at the end of the 1990s. In fact, 1/4 of the Soviet population and 1/2 of the industrial capability are located in only 100 cities. So one single French or British submarine commander will have enough power to meet McNamara's criteria by the end of the 1990s. Now, I think that when we're talking about that kind of power, particularly when we hope that we're also going to see declining American and Soviet arsenals, that we have to take another look at European security and how these powerful forces fit into the overall alliance effort. But then you've got horizontal proliferation. It's estimated now that there are 20 countries that either have or are in the process of acquiring ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear or a chemical warfare charge. And this is going to be a very, very serious problem for the United States and other major powers in the years to come. Let me turn to the Latin challenge. William Colby, who once headed the Central Intelligence Agency, has argued that the greatest security threat facing the United States in the remaining years of this century is not the Soviet Union and its nuclear arsenal. It is unmanaged immigration from Latin America. there's certainly grounds to believe that he may be right. An attack from the Soviet Union is almost unimaginable, whereas the continued flow of illegal immigration seems inevitable. And yet, if the flows get too great, it could create very serious social and political problems for the United States. And let's just look at one country to understand what the dimension of the problem is. It's estimated that Mexico, in the years remaining in this century, is going to have to create 1 million jobs a year because of new people coming onto the job market. Now, that is simply mission impossible for the Mexican government. Even when they were growing at 6% real growth rate in the 60s and 70s, they were only creating about 700,000 jobs a year. Now, because of the debt problem, they've had virtually zero growth. And you have to ask yourself, where are those young people going to go? They're not just going to sit there and starve. They're going to come north. And if we continue to, we already have in the Caribbean our own form of boat people from Haiti. Economic conditions are continuing to deteriorate there. If the civil strife in Central America can't be contained, we will continue to have a flow of immigrants from that area. I think that one major task of the Bush administration and its successor is to look seriously at what can be done in harmony with Latin American countries to create a real jobs program south of the border that will make life sufficiently decent so people will want to live in their own countries. And I think it's the kind of priority that should cause us, if we aren't willing to raise taxes, and apparently we aren't, to look at some of the other things that we're doing and see if we really believe that they're more important in terms of our security and welfare than attempting to do something like this. I think we're also going to have to work to keep our markets open. The Mexicans are either going to send us their tomatoes or they're going to send us their tomato pickers. And we have to decide what we want, what choice we want to make. The final challenge, I think, is the global challenge. And here I see a new chapter in international organizations. For most of the post-war period, the purpose of international organizations was the exchange of information and the establishment of standards to which countries would voluntarily adhere. I think toward the end of the Reagan administration, we crossed a Rubicon with the treaty that, the agreement that limited the consumption of materials deleterious to the ozone layer. I think that moved us into an era of international regulation, very serious international regulation. We're telling countries with that treaty that commercial activities that are profitable at the national level are disastrous at the international level, and therefore they must be closed down. And if you believe, as many of our scientists do, that the global warming phenomenon is a serious threat to the international community, then it seems to me that it's inevitable that there will be more such treaties in the years to come, with international institutions attempting to tell countries, tell industries what kinds of activities are desirable and in the globe's interest and which are not. It will be a tremendous challenge for governments. It will be a tremendous challenge for international institutions. It's not at all clear at this point that they have the capability to carry out this task, but at the same time, nobody knows who else might be given it. We know from recent years that we're likely to face a whole host of new international issues, from such things as AIDS, international health questions, to the phenomena of global warming or the destruction of the rainforests in the Amazon. All these, I think, will pose a new challenge for governments and a new challenge for international institutions. Now, this is a rather daunting agenda, I think, for any administration, for any country, and the question is, will we rise to it? If you look at what is likely to come in most of these areas, it seems to me that the threat is sufficient, that it is possible that we can act in time. And if we do act in time, I think it will be because of leadership across the country and not simply out of the White House. there is a tendency, I think, in this country, maybe in all countries, to want to look to somebody else to provide the lead. But in terms of what can be done, I look at, by people across the country, I look at the example of Japan. Henry Kissinger in his memoirs contends that if you look at the post-war period, the country that was the best governed of all major countries was Japan. And certainly that country was taken from the abyss in 1945 up to the very prominent place that it occupies today. Yet if you ask yourself, well, who led Japan? Who led Japan? There was no de Gaulle or Churchill or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or there was leadership across the country. People in this room decided that something had to change, that there was something worth protecting, and they proceeded to go out and do the job. And I think that's exactly what we have to do on a number of these very important issues facing our country and facing the international community.
The question is, how does China fit into any of this?
Well, China fits in several different ways. First, I think one of the big tasks of the international economy in the next, say, decade is going to be to integrate fully these major communist countries, including China, obviously. And this is going to be a difficult adjustment for us. But I think that in all the communist countries, with the possible exception of Cuba and maybe Albania and North Korea, there has been a decision made at the highest level that they want to participate in the international economy, and they want to be full participants. They're knocking at the door, and I think in the end we're going to have to open it up. But when we do, we have all kinds of very difficult decisions to make in terms of the governance of the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. I mean, some countries are going to lose votes in order to accord them to these countries, and we also have to make sure that we're operating on similar assumptions, so it's going to be very difficult. Now, I'm sure, though, that behind your question lay the issue of the events of June and how we should respond to that and why they took place. For those of you who are interested, I would urge you to read an article that we ran as the lead article in the last issue by a professor from Australia named John Fincher on why this all happened. And in brief, his argument is that there has been the kind of change taking place in China that I was describing in these other countries. When the events of June took place, many commentators here and also the Chinese leadership in effect said, well, as long as the peasants are satisfied, this is a peasant country, we don't have serious problems. But the last, as Professor Fincher pointed out, the last census in China revealed that the country is now perhaps as much as 40% urbanized. And this is where the agitation was coming for change. And I think that that pressure will continue to grow. And I think that in terms of designing our own policies, we should be reaching out to that kind of community in every way we can. It seems to me it's inevitable that China again will open up in the way that we thought was happening prior to June.
The question was, is there a chance that the Russians and the Germans might indeed make a deal of a kind in this new and interesting balance of power structure which may be emerging out of Central Europe?
I think it's extremely unlikely, and I think could only happen if we followed very, very foolish policies. If the United States were to reverse its position of 40 years in favor of a united and democratic Germany, if we were seen to be the obstacle preventing this, one can imagine a skillful Soviet diplomacy exploiting this and stoking patriotic feelings that could lead to some kind of rapprochement that would be detrimental to the West. But I honestly am not that concerned about that. I think it's highly unlikely. I think that one of the great successes of the post-war era has been the nature of the polity that has been created in West Germany. It's been one of the most responsible and civilized states that we've had in the international system. I think that the Europeans as a whole have learned their lesson from the Great Civil War that they fought really for more than 50 years, because there really is a continuum here from the First War to the Second, and that it really is unimaginable. At the same time, I think that we should be thinking of what kind of reassurances we and others need to be absolutely clear that this kind of development doesn't take place. I think we need to think very hard and carefully about what legitimate security concerns the Soviet Union has in Eastern Europe, so they can't try to advance illegitimate security concerns. And I think we have to look to our own needs as well.
The question is the United States government dragging its feet on the question of warming temperatures and acid rain?
Well, I think the environmental community does think that there is a dragging of the feet. At the big conference which was just held in Europe, the administration was unable to reach a command decision on whether we would even send a delegation, and the decision was not made by the president, but left up to the head of the Environmental Protection Agency as to whether he wanted to go, and obviously his hands were tied on the kinds of positions he would take. Will we change? Well, we all know that there is going to be a cost of disruption in these efforts. You take a state like West Virginia, it depends predominantly on the production of coal. And you see that the senators from West Virginia and the congressmen for West Virginia are assiduous in slowing down the pace of adjustment, because it's going to have a devastating effect, or they fear it will have a devastating effect on a state that is already one of the poorest in the Union. I think really what may change it, you have to ask yourself, what caused us to change our opinion on the ozone treaty, because we were earlier hostile to any such treaty. And as I understand it, two things changed it. One was that the scientists came up with very compelling evidence that persuaded people who had been dubious before that, in fact, the situation was changing at a much more rapid rate than we had earlier believed. And the second thing that happened is that the major producer of refrigerants in the United States, DuPont, discovered an alternative, and so changed its position from opposition to a treaty to support for a treaty. That's both reassuring and not so reassuring, because we aren't going to discover a technical fix in every one of these areas. We're going to have to probably take some tougher decisions. But if the accumulation of scientific evidence continues as it appears to be continuing, it seems to me that you will get more and more of a global consensus that action has to be taken. There's already, I suppose if you're a scientist, you might argue that the pace of change has been very slow, but if you think back to the change in attitudes in this country and in other countries on this subject, it really is astonishing. Ronald Reagan came into office running in 1980, arguing that trees caused more pollution than automobiles. You remember that statement? He also was extremely hostile to the idea of any international cooperation in these fields. International institutions were seen as anti-American, promoting interventionist policies, and yet that was the president who signed off on the ozone treaty, which is certainly one of the most far-reaching treaties we've ever negotiated in this area. So, I think this is an area where people are willing to learn, even people who have very, very fixed positions. And then the problem is that many of us have interests that are going to be adversely affected, and we've got to find some way to accomplish this adjustment in a reasonably fair way, or we're going to be paralyzed with political disputes.
I think the question is, does Japan have to be more responsible in areas such as ecology as we move ahead into the next several decades?
Well, I think they do, and I can see why I was speaking extemporaneously, and I can see how my comments might have left the impression that I thought that Japan was a model country. I don't think Japan's a model country at all. I think that they have lots of policies that they need to change too. I was citing that as an example, however, of sort of societal leadership. The fact is that a country that is facing a big challenge can rise to it. I limit my comments to that. I think that Japan, with its new strength and wealth, needs to acquire a constructive global role. I think that's very important that they play that. Right now, for example, Japan is having a major debate within its government as to whether it should aid Poland. I think Japan should aid Poland. I think that's very important for them to aid Poland. I think we should be putting pressure on the Japanese to aid Poland. They have a responsibility, I think, that they've acquired through their success to try to maintain the international system. And saving Poland is part now of the effort of trying to maintain this international system. So we need a better and more constructive response from Japan on precisely such issues.
The question was, if there's reunification of Germany as a possibility, and the Russians propose that they will agree to reunification if there is neutralization, what in that hypothetical situation should be the response of the United States government?
I don't think that we can really determine that, quite honestly. If we manage to maneuver ourselves in a situation where the Soviets can make such an offer and the Germans can be strongly tempted to accept it, what are we going to do? Send troops into the Chancellor's office and throw him out of power? No, we can't do that. What we can do, I think, is insist that any Germany that is reunited in Europe accept certain obligations in the security field that ensure that it is not a threat to any of its neighbors. But I don't think that we can determine the political future of Germany. The people, I mean, one of the interesting things that's happening in Eastern Europe right now is that the people of Eastern Europe are making policy, not the governments. The governments are the last to know what is going on, racing to catch up, including our own, for that matter. I mean, this is, you've got a revolution going on here. It is a peaceful revolution, and therefore, almost awe-inspiring that 1 million people could get out in the streets of Germany a couple of days ago, and there wasn't a single casualty, nor a single report of beating or rioting. Tremendous discipline shown by the East German people, who everybody thought had no tradition of this. So, I really think that if they decide that they want to, if you get a democratic system and a democratic Germany decides it wants to be united and neutral, then I think that decision has been taken. What we have a right to demand in that case, and what Germany's neighbors have a right to demand, is assurances as to what kind of Germany it's going to be in its external policies. And there I think we would have a big influence. But I don't think we can determine the political character of the German government.
Why do you see the need for a continued U.S. presence in Europe?
I think you used the word permanently. Yeah. Because I think that after two wars that have drawn the U.S. in, that the United States provides a certain kind of reassurance and balance to the European scene that they believe they need and that history shows has been useful. At the same time, I have to acknowledge that I think the chance of war is extremely slight. Has been since 1945. I think there's been very little likelihood that there ever was going to be a war on the European scene after 1945. But governments are nervous. The United States presence there, I think, has had a reassuring effect. And when I talk about a permanent presence, I don't mean large numbers of troops. I mean some kind of military relationship, as long as the Europeans want it. Now, if they decide they don't want it and don't need it, that's another question. But at this point, they're contending they do. I think we ought to be willing to enter into some kind of relationship with them, but at a much reduced level.
Is there, in fact, a lack of continuity in American foreign policy? And if so, how would you create that kind of continuity?
Well, this kind of question is debated all the time inside the Beltway, and usually the answer that's given to the question is yes, this is a terrible problem. In fact, I don't think it is. There has been tremendous continuity in American foreign policy from administration to administration. All administrations have basically followed the containment policy against the Soviet Union. The Eisenhower administration rhetorically threatened to change it, the so-called rollback promise of 1952. But when revolutions broke out in Hungary and Poland, John Foster Dulles said publicly that it would be crazy to try for the United States to try to intervene militarily. It'd bring on World War III. So there was a rhetorical suggestion of difference, but in fact it remained the same. We've had basically the same policy in the Middle East from one administration to another. We've had basically the same policy toward Latin America from one administration to another. There are certain issues, however, where there are differences, and they get reflected in the domestic politics of the United States. There have been at various times differences on U.S. policy towards South Africa. And the Democratic Party has been more inclined to want to put sanctions on South Africa to push the anti-apartheid cause. We have had big struggles in recent years on two issues, Vietnam and Central America. But there, I would argue, the problem is not the conflict between the Congress and the executive branch. I would argue the problem was, and certainly in Vietnam, Democrats did it as much as Republicans, the problem was that administrations in power tried to carry out a policy that they could not explain to the American people. And when they found they could not do that, they engaged in deception, which began to shade into illegality. And it practically destroyed two administrations. I mean, you had the secret bombing of Cambodia, for example, where we actually had generals lying in their reports back to Washington about what they'd done, but with orders from the White House to do this. And obviously, an administration that does such a thing, unless it can keep this completely secret, is, quickly exposed to very serious political problems. That's what happened in Central America. But if you ask yourself, well, what was the cause of the difficulty? I would argue it was not because the Congress and the White House couldn't get together. It was the fact that we had administrations in place that had policies they tried to carry out that they knew they could not get adequate support for among the American people, and they therefore engaged in deception and illegality in order to carry out that policy, and they got caught.
The editor of Foreign Policy has provided us with an extraordinarily interesting and educational evening. We're grateful to you, sir.
Thank you very much.